to handle a particular perspective on a very complex issue. You might disagree with him. Certainly you will if you have strong ties to Israel, and of course I would be entirely respectful of that. But his ability to marshal a relatively complex argument I think is interesting. And I suppose if we're considering ways that this situation might be resolved, we're going to have to consider that it's not black and white. Certainly, any point of view that's about the absolute vilification and demonization of any group of people, whether that's the Israelis as oppressive monsters or the Palestinian people and Hamas in particular as sort of subhuman, is not likely to lead to any resolution. Isn't it extraordinary too that our culture has marginalized and maligned Andrew Tate for a variety of allegations which he stringently denies and mostly portrays him as an imbecilic figure, and yet here he seems to me very competent and able to handle a conversation around an issue that many people don't want to go near.
What is your reaction to what happened on October the 7th?
Sure, I'll answer the question professionally. I do not condone the loss of human life on either side. I think anybody doing anything which directly damages civilians is disgusting and abhorrent. However, I would be an amateur if I could not sit and pretend I do not understand the motivations behind either side. This is not even me taking a side. I understand why Israel is doing what it's doing. I understand why Palestine is doing what it's doing. However, I still call the Israeli actions absolutely abhorrent and genocidal.
Okay, we're going to come to Israel's actions, I promise you. We will ask that question specifically. But in terms of what Hamas did on October the 7th, do you accept that was an act of terrorism?
It's an interesting question because
once again, really.
It is.
It's a very straightforward question.
Because you're the person who would have called Nelson Mandela a terrorist while he was still in jail, and one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
I wouldn't have
For me
called
to
him
answer
that.
the question, yes, you would have.
Culture moves now more quickly than it ever has, and we have to be aware of these categorizations. Myself, I don't have any problem describing massacres and kidnaps as acts of terror, but similarly, it's important to look at the origins of these conditions, and Tate's claim that even those events had a point of origin is one that's worthy of considering. Let me know in the chat what you think. Of course, Piers Morgan's position is that nothing could ever justify those acts. Curiously, what Andrew Tate subsequently does is invites Piers Morgan to take this issue on from a personal perspective, i.e. if you yourself had lost family members, if you'd had your house blown up, if you'd had your house invaded, would you be considered? And I suppose this is a question we all ask of ourselves, isn't it? And that's why I continually say, if you are directly involved, I'm not preaching to you, because if anybody went near my children, I know even from recent events where I've been subject to personal attacks, that the protection of your family becomes absolutely paramount. So I can only imagine what it would be like if that was a military attack, terrorist attacks, or whatever attack. What I am sensitive to as well is that outside of this issue, power is able to label its enemies and their violence as terroristic and abhorrent, and their own violence as rational and necessary. Even in this conversation, when it talks about the barbaric murders that took place on October the 7th, they are graphically described. The details of the drama, which are appalling, are plainly laid out. But when you just think of 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on a city, it's still brutal and disgusting and appalling. It's not as dramatic or as vivid. You don't deploy the same kind of image systems. You don't envisage the same drama. But ultimately, when Andrew Tate talks about a 15-year-old girl having her legs blown off and having lost her parents, ultimately we're describing the same kind of situation. And isn't there going to be, if ever a solution were to be reached, and I'm certainly not imagining we're going to resolve it during the course of this video, won't it require a different type of perspective? At some point, are we going to have to say, this violence is wrong and this violence is wrong? I mean, in a way, it's similar to what we discussed when talking about American domestic politics. If you are pro-free speech, you must be pro the free speech of your opponents. If you are anti-violence, you must be against the violence that might advance your own cause. So plainly, as most people now are anti-violence, surely, a ceasefire and a cessation to hostility has to be what the world's political bodies would favour and be advancing towards together, doesn't it? Surely a ceasefire should be a priority, and creating the conditions for a de-escalation of violence should be what's being discussed.
For me to answer the question, I have to be very professional, Piers. For me to sit on the outside in Romania with no personal involvement in Israel-Palestine, it's easy for me to say, yes, it was an act of terror. However, if I was in Gaza, if I was in an open-air prison, if my family had been annihilated by bombs from the sky, if everybody I knew had suffered the loss of a loved one, if I had no chance of any kind of freedom or democracy or standard of life, would I believe it was an act of terror, or would I believe it's an act of resistance against oppression? You have to be very careful how you answer these questions.
So what do you think?
I think I understand what happens when you take people and put them in such an inhumane condition. For anybody to sit and say that you're going to take people and put them in absolutely inhumane conditions and give them no standard of life, and they're not allowed to ever fight back, or they are terrorists.
But I can agree with you.
Anyone who does that is an amateur.
I can agree with you that the plight of the Palestinians for many decades has been absolutely shameful.
So what did we think was going to happen, Piers?
No, nothing justifies what happened on October the 7th.
So what are they supposed to do?
Nothing.
So what are they supposed to do?
That was an act of medieval barbaric terrorism. Nothing justifies it.
Did they suffer acts of medieval? Did they suffer acts of medieval barbaric terrorism before that date? Yes. And it's unfortunately an eye for an eye in this world. I'm not condoning. I'm being a professional and answering to you why it happened.
Give me one example. Are they a terror group or not?
They're one team's freedom fighter, and they're deemed a terrorist
group. What
do
you think?
I think that if you lock people in an open-air prison and steal their land, they're going to retaliate.
So they're not a terror group?
I think they're going to retaliate.
In a sense, trying to achieve an objective set of labels is a fool's errand, because if that were possible, there would not be a conflict at all. If we were able to say, well, this is terrorism, that's not terrorism, that's justified violence, that's not justified violence. I think any sane person, and indeed Andrew Tate said several times that the events of October the 7th are unconscionable, and he seems to me to be merely trying to provide a historic context under which such acts would be conceivable, for indeed they happened. I suppose one of the things that's difficult to accept is when either group are cast as subhuman. And I've seen very successful and very eloquent commentators say that the problem is that Hamas are a distinct group with a different mindset. And indeed, this is, I suppose, the very definition of Islamophobia, the idea that Islam in itself is a religion that valorizes violence, and therefore it should be excluded from the progressive world or the democratic world. We consistently hear Islam described in terms that appear to deny it the right to exist at all. This is from the Times of Israel and offers some interesting analysis of how this situation may have escalated and what the contributory factors could have been. For years, the various governments led by Benjamin Netanyahu took an approach that divided power between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, bringing Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to his knees while making moves that propped up the Hamas terror group. The idea was to prevent Abbas or anyone else in the Palestinian Authority's West Bank government from advancing toward the establishment of a Palestinian state. Thus, amid this bid to impair Abbas, Hamas was upgraded from a mere terror group to an organisation with which Israel held indirect negotiations via Egypt, and one that was allowed to receive infusions of cash from abroad. Meanwhile, Israel has allowed suitcases holding millions in Qatari cash to enter Gaza through its crossings since 2018 in order to maintain its fragile ceasefire with the Hamas rulers of the Strip. Most of the time, Israeli policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as an asset. Far-right MK Bezalel Smotrich, now the finance minister in the hardline government and leader of the religious Zionism party, said so himself in 2015. So regarding Hamas as an asset is an extraordinary perspective given the obvious hostilities and the events of October the 7th. This is very different from saying that Israel bears responsibility for those terrorist attacks. When you look at a conflict with this deeper and as troubling history as this one, it's difficult to isolate individual components with it and not see it just as an extraordinary mess. When we spoke to Chris Hedges recently, he said that the problems in this region are typical of any colonial settler enterprise, and if you extract the unique historical and religious connection between Israel and Israeli people to that land and regard it in the same way you would South Africa or indeed the Americas themselves, many of the patterns become more observable. Again, it's difficult to not be drawn into a position where you seem to be saying either Israel doesn't have the right to exist or the Palestinian people don't have the right to exist. There seems like these strong poles that want to pull you to one of those places. How can we, as the citizens of a progressive world, resist these two poles that seem to be pulling you towards violence and extermination and condemnation and find a way to say, hold on a minute, aren't we all just human beings? Is there a way through this? Or are we all going to just tribalize to the point where none of us can do anything but hate? According to various reports, Netanyahu made a similar point at a Likud faction meeting in early 2019 when he was quoted as saying that those who oppose a Palestinian state should support the transfer of funds to Gaza because maintaining the separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So it does seem that there's some political advantage within certain quarters of Israeli government in keeping those two regions distinct and opposed, and even, extraordinary though it may sound, in allowing Hamas to somehow prosper over in a limited way because it's a destabilizing influence within the region. And I suppose the reason that Andrew Tate is unwilling to say, yes, that's a terrorist attack, yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization, because by saying those things, you are denying the complexity that even this article within the Israeli Times seems to allude to, that there have been points where Hamas have been fostered, facilitated, ignored, and even funded in order to destabilize an already unstable region. And when you look at the complex historical context, it becomes impossible to solve this problem with either Israel are evil or Palestine is evil or neither of these sides or either of these sides don't have the right to exist. Therefore, difficult conversations where you listen intently to perspectives of people that you completely disagree with are entirely necessary. And when you look at what our culture is doing more broadly, censoring, cutting people off, shutting people down, unpersoning folk, debanking people, that's the opposite of what's required if you want anything other than the advance of centralized authority, the advance of tyranny, and the crushing of almost anybody outside of that.
They're not a terror group.
One team's terrorists is another
Okay, we're
team's
now up
freedom
to about
fighter.
8. Are they a terror group?
And also, another thing I want to make clear to you, Piers.
Only Jeremy Corbyn has done this.
Done what?
Refused to answer the question.
I think that what they are doing is seemingly deemed an act of terror by the people that the terror...
Don't use weaselly words.
They're not weaselly. Of course the Israelis think they're a terror group, and of course the Palestinians think they're freedom fighters. It's stupid that you're asking the question.
Most of the
it's clear.
civilized world thinks they're a terror group who committed an act of terrorism. It's not difficult. What they did was an act of terrorism.
And I think that if Israel continues to conduct acts of terrorism on the Palestinian people, they're going to do nothing but strengthen the reaction.
What I think is interesting about this is whether or not you agree with Andrew Tate, in this instance, the perspectives of the people of Palestine. You have to consider it somewhat valuable and important that these views and perspectives are expressed, and indeed significant that conversations between people who disagree with each other have a certain value. Increasingly, what's being created is an environment where certain views are marginalized and extracted. It's clear that how the media primarily functions is to present information in a way that makes it very difficult to have an opposing view. For example, just the chronology that Andrew Tate referred to, why are you starting this story in the middle, some of the semantics, one man's terrorist group is another man's freedom fighter. These are all arguments that outside of this highly contentious subject at this highly contentious moment, most people on the left or the right would agree with. The reason when we've been covering this issue, I've continually said if you're connected to Israel or if you're connected to Palestine, I'm not attempting to change your perspective, is because if this becomes such a highly polarized issue that there's nothing but people hating one another on either side, even people that are existing in cultural communities that are not directly affected, it seems impossible to me that we'll be able to solve this issue or many others